to others. Now, he wrote that many years ago, before we began to seek to bring our form of government to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think it was worth thinking about, at least in my case, because I had just returned from spending a week in Afghanistan as one of an international observer team observing the Afghan national elections, only the second national election for president in the history of a country that goes back probably 3,000 or 4,000 years. And I was thinking of the 68,000 American forces there who are seeking to bring something like our form of government to the Afghan people, 33 million Afghans in a country just smaller than the state of Texas, a very ancient tribal society, even at a time when we were seeing on television Americans screaming rather violently in some cases at their elected representatives about how terrible they felt our government was. Now, I don't know who is right in this kind of paradox, but it does seem to me, at least as a concerned American, that it's strange that so many Americans don't like our form of government, but we are spending tens of billions of taxpayers' dollars and the lives, more importantly, of our sons and daughters to bring that same kind of government to people around the world, sometimes by force. Let me talk a bit about that experience in Afghanistan, if I may, by way of transition to the topic that Irina imposed upon me, U.S.-Russian relations, because in some ways they fit together. I had never been in Afghanistan before, but given the fact we have had armed forces there for the last 8 years in combat and suffering casualties, and that we fought a kind of covert war there against the Soviet Union for about 15 years in the 70s and 80s, that it might be a country that would be interesting to know something about, and particularly at a time of a critical national election. There were at least 4 distinct observer groups, one sent by the United Nations, one sent by the European Union, and 2 sent by the government of the United States. And there were only 6 in my group, but the organization that sponsored us had been in Afghanistan building political institutions for about the last 8 years. And so they had a network of young people, by and large, across the country in the 34 provinces, where at least it was in those provinces where it was safe for them to be. And so we were really the tip of the spear in terms of observation. When the election came, our job was to receive and report the information given us by that national network about voter turnout, about possible fraud or abuses in the process, about whether women were being discriminated against, about the process generally, and whether it was being carried out and conducted in what seemed like a basically honest way. Now, again, 6 of us, even with an organization of 100 in the field, in our case, we were operating from the capital city of Kabul, could not visit every polling place. There were some 6,700 distinctive official voting places, many of those in the east and south, the most unstable and dangerous parts of the country, were considered highly dangerous. Our group traveled back and forth to the U.S. Embassy in $300,000 to $400,000 armored vehicles. We wore very thick flak jackets and very thick helmets, and it was a war zone. And the election was on a Thursday, I think about actually 3 weeks ago today, if I'm correct. And the results would not be tabulated, given the kind of primitive nature of the country, officially until the 17th of September. And I'm sure many of you have been following those results as they have unfolded. Basically, in the press conference we held 2 days later, as we were leaving Afghanistan, we reported that there had been a few instances of questionable behavior in some of the polling places where our observers were. We saw none of that in the capital city of Kabul. But there was great concern that in those more dangerous areas, not only would the turnout be low, but those areas would be fraught with peril in terms of opportunities for fraudulent results. As it turns out, that is by and large what has happened. And it is those, I don't know exactly how many, 500 or 600, I think, polling places where more votes were cast than there were registered voters, or all the votes cast were for one candidate, by and large the incumbent President Karzai, or any one of a number of irregularities. All this being conducted, by the way, against the backdrop of threats from the Taliban, our basic enemy there, that if people did vote, they would be subject to assassination. And one of the questions we received at our press conference, by and large from the Western press, quite a few reporters were there, journalists and television cameras, was about whether a 40% turnout, which was what was being predicted, of eligible voters would be disappointing. And I thought that was rather strange, because we saw men and women standing in long lines in the dust and the heat under the threat of death. And so my response at the press conference was, I did not know a democracy in the world, including my own, where if for voting one was threatened with death, where the turnout would be 40%. So my view was the glass was way over half full and not half empty. We have off-year elections where barely 40% of the American people turn out, including for elections for Congress. And we've had national elections in presidential years where the turnout didn't exceed 40% by a whole lot. So whether journalists or non-journalists, we have to be very careful about the way we view emerging democracies in this respect. Whether we're ordinary citizens, taxpayers, or working journalists. To me, the very fact that these people could hold a national election, and it was an election held by the Afghan people and the Afghan government, was a triumph of sorts against incredible odds. The fact that there were provincial council elections going on at the same time, and that many of the candidates for those provincial councils, we don't have quite the equivalent here. If it would be as if there were a kind of county commission at the state level, and people run for those offices. But a good third or more of the candidates for those provincial council offices were women. And when we had dinner with our superb ambassador, Ambassador Eikenberry, former retired 3-star Army general who had commanded the forces in Afghanistan, at the dinner he said, progress is being made, but we have a long way to go. He said, by way of a benchmark and a starting point, keep in mind that less than 10 years ago, 1 mile from the American embassy, at a soccer stadium holding 30,000 people, the Taliban routinely forced people to go to that soccer stadium to fill it up for the purpose of seeing truckloads of women accused of various kinds of behavior brought into the arena, forced to kneel down, and shot in the back of the head. So